Welcome to a battlefield the size of nightmares. October 1916, Eastern Front. Russian soldiers had marched through mud-choked fields, through fog so thick it clung to their coats, muffling footsteps, and yet nothing prepared them for what loomed ahead. Iron wheels taller than a man scarred the earth. Massive barrels pointed skyward, black and ominous, each a promise of destruction. Men scrambled, some frozen in awe, others laughing nervously, unsure if fear or adrenaline guided their muscles. The air smelled of damp earth and gunpowder. Shells sat in neat rows waiting. The ground quivered. Each heartbeat echoed like a drum of doom. The soldiers whispered among themselves, "How can such monsters exist?" And yet here they were, real, alive, ready to fire. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening. Imagine standing there, watching giants that could flatten entire trenches. Could you hold your ground, or would you run? October 1916. The Eastern Front stretched endlessly under a slate-gray sky. Mud caked every inch of the worn boots, the trenches carving deep scars into the landscape. Frost lingered on the edges of the churned earth. The air smelled of iron gunpowder and the faint tang of fear. A cold wind swept over the plains, rattling tin helmets and whipping the canvas of temporary command tents. Distant hills shivered under the roar of artillery. Somewhere beyond the fog, enemy cannons replied in kind, each report a hammer on the minds of men. Russian infantry moved in staggered lines. Rifles slung bayonets, catching what little light filtered through the clouds. Some soldiers stumbled over frozen clumps of mud, their hands raw, their faces streaked with grime. The horses, thin and skittish, stamped nervously, ears flicking, tails lashing. The generals atop the ridges observed the scene, binoculars pressed to their eyes. Maps rolled beneath their hands, ink smudged by the moisture in the air. They whispered orders, measured distances, calculated angles, each movement a prayer that their men would survive the next barrage. Smoke hung low, clinging to the trenches, drifting in thick, slow waves. Shells screamed overhead, whistle sharp, and the earth trembled with every distant impact. Men ducked instinctively. Fingers gripped rifle stocks. Eyes scanned the horizon. Anticipation built like the coiled tension of a spring. Every moment was a calculation of fear, of courage, of survival. Beyond the first line of trenches, the artillery waited. Colossal monsters of steel and iron, their wheels dug into the soil, as if the ground itself could not bear their weight. Each barrel gleamed darkly, an ominous promise. The crews moved with careful precision, hushed voices carrying the weight of protocol. Powder charges laid out in neat stacks, shells aligned like the teeth of some monstrous beast ready to devour. Russian soldiers approaching cautiously could feel the ground hum beneath their feet, metal and earth resonating in a low, ominous pulse. Fires burned in scattered hearths behind the front lines, smoke curling into the gray sky. The smell of cooking meat mixed strangely with gunpowder. Officers conferred quietly. Maps were studied, notes exchanged. The human machinery of war moved in tandem with the gears of metal monsters ahead. Sergeant Petrov's men trudged forward, boots sucking at the mud rifles bouncing against their shoulders. Ivanov beside him swallowed, hard eyes fixed on the colossal silhouette of the siege cannon looming through the mist. Stories had spread among the men. Tales of guns so large they could flatten entire villages. Whispered accounts of men crushed by the recoil. Yet nothing compared to seeing them in reality. The terrain itself seemed to conspire against the soldiers. Trenches snaked like serpents through churned mud. Shell craters became miniature lakes freezing over in the bitter air. The uneven ground forced careful steps, each one a test of balance and concentration. A misstep could mean plunging into water mud or worse. Whispered legends had grown from such misfortunes. Ghostly figures said to wander the front lines at dawn, soldiers who had fallen and not yet crossed. Voices heard over the wind, a cold warning to those who dared approach too closely. Cannon crews moved in silence, hands moving over steel with ritualistic precision. The first shell was loaded. Men tightened leather straps, adjusted iron cranks, measured trajectories. And yet beyond the mechanical reality, there was awe, fear, a recognition of power that dwarfed any human scale. Russian soldiers paused, staring, some whispering prayers, others swallowing hard and forcing their feet forward. The ground trembled with potential energy, a beast coiled and ready to strike. Birds, startled by the noise and smell, rose in frantic flocks from nearby trees. Their wings flapped against the gray sky, black silhouettes cutting through the mist, a reminder that life persisted. And yet the shadow of war stretched long. It touched every creature. Every blade of grass flattened under marching boots. Every twig snapped under hurried feet. Each heartbeat matched the cadence of distant shells. Behind the lines, engineers worked tirelessly. Logs of production schematics for shell casings, barrels measured and remeasured. The scale of the endeavor was staggering. A single gun required months of labor, dozens of men. The collective effort of factories, rail lines, and workshops, all culminating in these machines of destruction. The soldiers on the front could feel the weight of that labor, the hum of human industry, the ghost of steel being born. Conversations were sparse, muffled beneath the wind and the distant boom of artillery. Yet when they spoke, voices carried awe and disbelief. "How can such a thing exist?" whispered one. "It's not a weapon. It's a mountain," another replied. And in those words, a truth lingered. The soldiers were dwarfed, not just physically, but in spirit, confronted with the immensity of modern war. The sky darkened slightly. Clouds thickened, blotting out what little light remained. Shadows stretched long across the mud, and the soundscape intensified. The hiss of distant shells, the creak of iron wheels, the groan of earth under weight, the staccato of orders barked from officers' lips, all coalesced into a symphony of anticipation, a tension that gripped the spine, that slowed the pulse, that made each breath a conscious act. Men in the trenches tightened their grips, adjusted coats, glanced at their comrades. Some eyes darted nervously to the massive cannons. Others stared ahead, rigid with determination. The fog swallowed outlines, leaving only the sound. A whisper of doom traveling through the cold air. Every step forward felt like crossing a threshold, a line between human endurance and mechanical inevitability. Beyond the fog, the enemy waited. Artillery emplacements hidden in forested ridges, their barrels dark against the sky. Soldiers barely visible through mist and shadow. The calculus of battle played out silently. Distances measured, angles noted, shells loaded, and the human element poised delicately between fear and resolve. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of artillery, the rhythmic thump of distant cannon fire. A reminder that time was finite, that decisions made now would echo in seconds, in minutes, in the lives of those standing frozen in the cold. And in that instant, Russian soldiers felt it, the enormity of what they faced, a confrontation not just with men, not just with numbers, but with the embodiment of industrial power, the siege cannon, monstrous, immovable, inevitable, and yet somehow alive, humming through the earth, a reminder that war had grown beyond mere human scale, and that the front, the Eastern Front, October 1916, would test them in ways unimaginable. The siege cannon, a marvel of industrial scale, and a nightmare for the men who faced it. Each piece of artillery weighed over 20 tons, a weight that dwarfed the soldiers approaching it. The barrel alone stretched nearly 15 feet, steel dark and polished. The crew of 20 men worked in unison, each motion precise. A slip, a miscalculation could mean death. Logs from the Austro-Hungarian Ordnance Office detail the exact dimensions. The base of the cannon measured 12 feet across, supported by reinforced timber and iron bracing. It could fire shells of 800 pounds, each propelled with a charge sufficient to flatten a small village. Rail systems had been laid to transport these beasts. Temporary tracks carved into the mud. Wagons and horses strained against the immense weight. Engineers recorded each movement. Hours, days, sometimes weeks to reposition a single gun. The scale of effort was staggering. Yet the men on the front line felt it physically. The ground seemed to hum, vibrating with the energy of the loaded shells. The air itself carried the tang of iron and the faint scent of oil. Distance measurements had been taken with painstaking care. Charts indicated ranges up to 9,000 meters. Accuracy tested with dummy shells over frozen rivers and uninhabited villages. Each shot a demonstration of industrial precision. Russian observers noted the recoil. The ground cracked. Mud and earth displaced with every firing. Eyewitness reports from the front described the concussion traveling along the trenches. Men staggered, ears ringing, boots slipping in the churned mud. And yet the cannon fired again and again. Relentless, almost alive. A mechanical predator. The crew worked in choreography. Powder measured in kilograms, shells hoisted with ropes and pulleys, each motion rehearsed. Yet despite the order, folklore crept in. Whispers among soldiers told of guns that had a mind of their own, barrels that shifted unexpectedly, recoil that crushed men who dared to stand too close. Tales grew from accidents, a crew member pinned under a wheel, a shell detonating prematurely, each story adding to the aura of terror. Reports detail that each gun required a supply chain of extraordinary scale, daily deliveries of powder fuses, shells, and lubricants, teams of men marching carrying provisions, reinforcing positions. Engineers kept meticulous notes, every bolt, every rivet accounted for. The cannon was not just a weapon. It was an industrial achievement, a symbol of the modern war. And the soldiers felt its weight, physically, mentally, spiritually. Russian intelligence had counted at least 4 of these guns in position along the Eastern Front. Their placement strategically chosen, overlooking valleys, commanding hills, dominating fields. Calculations indicated that any assault would have to contend with overlapping fire. Maps in the hands of commanders displayed arcs of destruction, concentric circles radiating from each barrel. The math alone was terrifying. The soldiers saw the numbers on paper. Then they saw the reality, and the reality was worse. Veteran soldiers whispered of previous encounters, of villages flattened in an instant, of trenches shattered, of comrades hurled into mud and snow. Diaries from officers recorded the psychological effect, morale faltering in the presence of these titans. One note read simply, "We faced steel and fire, not men." The line between machinery and monster blurred. The shell itself was a study in destructive engineering, filled with high explosive fused for maximum effect, striking with a thunderous crash, ejecting earth and debris in a violent wave. Every detonation left scars in the landscape, craters deep enough to swallow a small squad. Trees stripped of branches, soil displaced in cubic meters, the sound of impact echoing for miles. Artillery logs recorded velocity, impact force, shell trajectory. Russian engineers later attempted to calculate countermeasures, yet nothing fully mitigated the power. Observers noted the psychological toll. Men flinched before the gun even fired. Some turned away. Others gritted teeth trying to ignore the looming threat. The battlefield became as much a mental theater as a physical one. The cannon projected not just steel, but dread, its presence reshaping how men moved, how they thought, how they breathed. Despite all this, some soldiers marveled, awed by the ingenuity, the scale, the power. Letters home described the guns as mountains of iron, unstoppable, magnificent, terrifying. The duality of respect and fear pervaded every description. It was a machine, yet imbued with myth in the eyes of men. Each recoil, each roar adding to the legend. Rail logs and ordnance reports indicate firing rates. 1 shell every 5 minutes, continuous for hours. Calculations of tons of explosives per day. The sheer energy unleashed capable of altering terrain, destroying infrastructure, shaping the course of engagements, and the soldiers staring from the trenches could only watch, measure their own insignificance against this engineered monstrosity. Some journals record anecdotes bordering on the supernatural. The cannon, they said, seemed to sense intent, to anticipate movement, a ghostly intuition born from repeated fire. Men swore the vibration carried whispers, echoes of past detonations melding with the wind, a living presence of war. Whether myth or stress-induced perception, the legend grew, reality and folklore intertwined. Maps, photographs, and diagrams survive, detailing placement, elevation, trajectory. Historians would later marvel at the scale, engineers at the precision, soldiers at the terror. Each layer reinforcing the magnitude, fact layered over legend, evidence of the industrial age's intrusion into human conflict, and every number, every specification, reinforced the truth the men felt, that standing in front of this cannon was to face something beyond comprehension, beyond ordinary human scale. And so the soldiers waited, shivering in mud, gripping rifles, eyes fixed on the looming barrels, calculating, imagining, fearing. The fact layer of artillery statistics had become a lived reality. Every measurement, every log, every figure of weight and range translated into heartbeats, into sweat, into frozen fingers clutching iron. The monstrous reality of industrial warfare, rendered in steel fire and smoke. Private Ivanov pressed himself against the cold timber of the trench wall, mud caking his uniform, soaking through his gloves, each breath fogged in the frigid October air. The ground trembled beneath him. A distant boom echoed, followed by a low, vibrating pulse that traveled through the mud and bones alike. He gritted his teeth. The iron taste of fear filled his mouth. Sergeant Petrov leaned over the edge, binoculars trained on the massive artillery looming beyond the fog. "Steady. Watch the recoil," he muttered, his voice rough from wind and smoke. The men beside him shifted uneasily. Some whispered prayers, others tightened grips on rifles that felt absurdly light against the enormity of what awaited them. A shell exploded somewhere downrange. The ground jumped. Mud and snow sprayed over the parapet. A soldier flinched, yelping softly, clutching his helmet. Petrov steadied him with a hand to the shoulder. "It's only the first round. We survive this," he said. But the words were swallowed by the roar of engines and the distant clatter of iron wheels against frozen earth. Ivanov's eyes traced the silhouette of a cannon, taller than any building he had seen, black steel glinting faintly under the gray sky, a mechanical giant breathing fire and smoke. He remembered the stories whispered among the men, of guns that had crushed entire villages, of recoil that sent men flying into mud, of explosions that could hollow out hills. And now he saw it. Real. Impossibly real. Standing there, waiting. The trench itself felt alive, mud squelching beneath boots, timber groaning under frost and weight, water pooling in the depressions. Boots slipped, splashing cold water into socks. The smell of wet earth and smoke clung to everything. Ivanov's fingers went numb as he adjusted the strap of his rifle, each movement deliberate, each motion a small victory against the chaos surrounding him. Corporal Mikhailov shouted orders across the trench. "Prepare the gun nests! Check your flanks!" Voices carried awkwardly, swallowed partially by the wind and mist. A young recruit stumbled, nearly falling over a discarded shell casing. Petrov caught him just in time. A tight nod, a whispered curse, and the march of survival continued. Beyond the fog, the cannon crews moved with eerie precision. The ground shuddered as iron wheels shifted. Ropes creaked under tension. Men hauled shells weighing nearly 800 pounds each. Ivanov watched, mesmerized. The sheer size, the coordination, the hum of potential energy. He felt dwarfed, insignificant. A single man against a mountain of steel and fire. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of birds startled from nearby trees. Black silhouettes wheeling over mud-churned fields, a reminder of life, fragile, fleeting. And yet the shadow of war pressed down heavier than the air itself. Every heartbeat, every breath measured against the hum of the massive cannon. Petrov gestured toward a wooden crate. "Load the mortar. Check the fuse." Men moved quickly, hands numb, eyes strained against the haze. Each action a repetition of training. Each decision a gamble. The fog obscured the enemy, but the cannon made its presence known. Every vibration, every echo, a signal that the world beyond the trench had grown monstrous. A nearby shell crater caught Ivanov's eye. Water frozen at the edges. The remnants of a village or perhaps just a farm. Trees stripped bare, smoke curling faintly. The impact had left a scar, a reminder of the destructive potential waiting ahead. Whispers spread along the line. Ghosts of previous battles, of men who had vanished in the roar of artillery. Folklore mixing with reality. Shadows moving where no one stood. Suddenly, a shell screamed overhead. The trench wall shivered. Ivanov flinched. Petrov grabbed his arm. "Hold steady. Count the seconds," he barked. They counted. The explosion distant, yet felt immediate. Vibrations running through boots, knees, and chest. The hum of anticipation. The pulse of fear, mingled with adrenaline. Private Volkov, nearest to Ivanov, muttered under his breath, "I've seen nothing like this. Not even in Petersburg. This is not war. It's madness." Ivanov nodded, swallowing hard. The words mirrored his own thoughts. Men stared, some silent, some muttering prayers, some daring to laugh nervously. The human spirit stretched thin, tested against iron and smoke. The engineers behind them worked tirelessly, adjusting angles, calculating trajectories, clipboards wet with condensation, pens smudged by the cold, the calculations precise. Yet the men on the front line felt only awe and dread. Each number translated into real danger. Every kilogram of shell, every meter of range, each second of delay, magnified into life or death stakes. Petrov's voice cut through the fog. "Steady. Eyes on the horizon. Remember your training." Ivanov's hands shook slightly, boots stuck in frozen mud. He glanced at comrades, some pale, some grim, all human, all mortal, facing monsters made of steel and fire, and yet they moved, forward, inch by inch, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat, a distant whistle of a shell, followed by a concussive boom. The trench walls vibrated. Mud spattered faces and uniforms. Men ducked instinctively. Ivanov's eyes watered, the roar in his ears, a sound that would stay with him forever. Yet he clutched his rifle, kept his stance, kept moving, because stillness meant death. And in this theater of war, movement was survival. And in that moment, amidst mud smoke and the distant groan of the cannon, Russian soldiers became participants in a mechanical symphony, each note a shell, each rhythm a pulse of industrial might and the human element. Fragile, nervous, courageous, intertwined with the monstrous, inseparable from the landscape of fire, steel, and fear. The numbers were staggering. On paper, the Austro-Hungarian guns were marvels of industrial design. Colossal steel, precise engineering crews drilled to perfection. Yet on the battlefield, reality diverged sharply from expectation. Russian intelligence had anticipated 4 siege cannons. The men now counted 6, and each one loomed larger, more formidable, more terrifying than the sketches and reports suggested. They had trained for long-range artillery, they had drilled against mortars, even the occasional howitzer. But nothing could prepare them for this. Outgunned, outproduced, outmaneuvered, the soldiers whispered comparisons. They have 6. We have 200 rifles. But what are rifles against mountains of steel? The question lingered in the cold air, unanswered, heavy with dread. Maps in officers' hands displayed arcs of destruction, circles radiating from each barrel. The math was simple, terrifying. Overlapping zones. Every field of approach under fire. Distances measured in meters. Calculations precise. Yet when Ivanov stood in the trench, staring across frozen earth, the numbers felt meaningless. A shell could obliterate what his mind could not comprehend. The contrast was clear. Predicted victory versus sudden collapse. Intelligence reports suggested the guns would be moved slowly, their impact delayed. But the enemy had anticipated Russian movements, positioning the artillery on elevated ridges concealed by fog and forest. Shells landed faster, more accurately than any simulations had suggested, and the men felt the mismatch immediately. The ground shook, timbers splintered. The landscape itself seemed to betray them. Orders barked from officers attempted to instill confidence. Hold your positions, maintain formation. Yet the soldiers felt the futility. Some obeyed out of duty, others out of fear. The hum of artillery punctuated every step, every breath. The human body against industrial power. A tiny instrument in a symphony of destruction. Each cannon fired in sequence, measured relentless. Engineers had calculated recoil, elevation, powder charge, precision that turned soil into craters, villages flattened in rehearsal exercises. Yet here the effect was amplified. The human mind struggled to reconcile numbers with lived experience. 800-pound shells, 9,000-meter range, 20-ton barrels. The math was cold, indisputable. The reality, bone-jarring, earth-shaking, incomprehensible. Reports from officers noted that morale wavered, whispers of panic, soldiers comparing their situation to previous battles. We faced mortars, we faced howitzers, but nothing like this. It's a mountain of steel, and it sees us. The fog thickened, carrying both smoke and superstition. Folklore seeped in. Tales of cursed weapons, of guns that never missed, of iron beasts hungry for flesh. Reality and legend intertwined seamlessly. The Russians attempted countermeasures, repositioning troops, digging auxiliary trenches, camouflaging positions. Every calculation a gamble. Engineers measured soil density, calculated trajectories. Yet the enemy's advantage persisted for each adjustment, for each maneuver. The massive guns anticipated, reacted, dominated. It was not merely firepower, it was presence. a psychological dominion as much as a physical one. Comparisons mounted in soldiers' minds. They have 6 siege cannons. We have 2 battalions of infantry. The mental arithmetic was cruel. Predicted victory versus sudden collapse. Expected defense versus overwhelming reality. Officers tried to convey hope, explaining overlapping fields of fire, potential flanking positions. Yet the men felt exposed, diminished, dwarfed, an ant beneath steel titans. Logs recorded shell velocities, impact force, craters measured, the environment itself reshaped. Every step forward risked obliteration. Every glance toward the horizon brought a reminder of industrial precision. The contrast between expectation and actuality crystallized in every heartbeat, every shiver, every hesitant breath. In the trenches, whispers of legend persisted. They say these guns can sense movement, that the recoil targets the bravest, the most reckless. Ivanov's mind wrestled with logic and superstition. He measured the distance, calculated angles, yet the shadow of fear loomed larger than any number. The human eye could not contain the scale. The mind could not process the threat. The contrast extended beyond numbers. The enemy's coordination seamless. The Russian command structure stressed. Orders delayed. Communication faltered under fog and blast. Predicted victory, an orderly march, a methodical advance collapsed into improvisation. Instinct survival. Each decision made in the trench could mean life or death. The disparity tangible, visceral. Each explosion was a lesson in futility. Earth flung skyward, timber splintered, soldiers ducked instinctively. Yet the cannon fired again, relentless, measured, precise, an inexorable force. And still the men pressed on, advancing, holding, waiting. Human courage against industrial inevitability. A theater of contrast, of escalation. By midday, the battlefield itself had transformed. Craters multiplying, trees stripped bare, mud churned into treacherous quagmires. Lines of sight altered, artillery dominated not just men, but geography. The gap between expected and actual impact grew. Predicted victory crumbled under the weight of steel and fire. And yet the soldiers endured. Because stillness meant surrender. Because courage, however fragile, persisted. Officers scribbled notes, tallying shells, trajectories, estimated casualties. Engineers recalculated, new positions plotted. But the artillery dictated the terms. The contrast was unavoidable. Outgunned versus outmanned. Expected success versus realized devastation. And every shell fired reinforced the lesson. Industrial power had overtaken human scale. The battlefield itself a testament to escalation. As evening approached, the fog thickened further. Shadows merged with smoke. The massive guns still stood, imposing, unstoppable. Each firing a reminder that prediction was no defense. Human ingenuity met machine precision. And the gap between expectation and reality remained. Stark, terrifying, unyielding. The morning haze lifted slowly, revealing a scarred landscape. Trenches flooded with melted snow. Timber splintered. Mud churned. The earth pockmarked with craters from the relentless siege. Russian soldiers emerged cautiously. Eyes wide, boots heavy in sodden mud. The enormity of what had occurred pressed down. Each step a reminder of the mechanical giants they had faced. Corpses lay silent, draped in mud. Rifles discarded. Helmets dented and stained. Yet for those who survived, the experience was etched deeper, in bones, in nerves, in the quiet, trembling cadence of each heartbeat. They had confronted industrial power and lived, barely. Sergeant Petrov walked among the men, eyes scanning the wreckage, counting those who remained. The losses were staggering. Every regiment diminished. Every squad tested beyond calculation. Yet amidst the horror, a strange resilience emerged. Soldiers whispered of courage, of holding the line, of standing before monsters and refusing to yield. The cannons, those colossal beasts of iron, still smoked, still ominous. Their shadows long across the mud and craters. The crews withdrew slowly, exhausted, the earth groaning beneath their weight. Engineers noted every movement, every recoil, every misfire, and later would report that the Russian front had survived against odds once deemed impossible, a numerical mismatch, a technological gap. Yet human will endured. Tales began to spread. Soldiers recounted the moment a shell passed just meters away, the mud and splintered timber flying, the roar deafening, the ground trembling, and how somehow they moved forward, survived. The stories grew in the telling, fact blending with folklore. Some spoke of guns that moved with purpose, others of whispers in the wind, shadows of men who had fallen yet lingered. The aftermath was measured. Artillery logs confirmed shells fired, distances traveled, craters formed. Yet human reports mattered most. Diaries, letters, whispered conversations. They told of the psychological toll, of eyes haunted by steel giants, of nights spent dreaming of recoil, of earth collapsing, of death brushing close. Some men would never speak of it. Others tattooed the memory into every recounting. Commanders reviewed maps, noting lost ground, preserved positions, adjustments made for the next engagement. The cannon's impact would be recorded in tactical analyses for decades. Yet the soldiers on the ground remembered only the immediacy, the pulse of fear, the tremor beneath their feet, the way the air vibrated with kinetic energy, the subtle, insidious whisper of inevitability. Rumors began circulating, whispers of cursed artillery, of guns possessed by spirits of the fallen. Each shell fired a ghostly echo. Some claimed to see silhouettes moving just beyond the fog, faces of comrades long gone. Legends took root alongside fact, a testament to the intersection of human perception and mechanical terror. The surviving soldiers carried the lessons forward, the weight of experience heavier than their packs. They spoke in quiet tones, measured words, understanding that industrial might could be faced, but never ignored. The front line had become a proving ground, human courage tested against steel and fire, and survived. Letters home spoke of awe, of disbelief, of the landscape transformed into a testament to power beyond comprehension. Villages razed, forests scarred. The battlefield itself a monument, not to victory or defeat, but to endurance, to the resilience of men standing before the unimaginable. Even the artillery crews noted the effect. In journals and logs, reports of men staring frozen, unflinching, some shaking, some murmuring prayers. The human element persisted, fragile yet indomitable. Each confrontation, each shell fired, leaving a mark not just on earth but on psyche, on the soul. As dusk fell, shadows lengthened. Fog rolled back over mud and timber. The battlefield became quiet, save for the distant groan of remaining guns, the hiss of cooling metal, the whispered wind carrying faint echoes. The men in trenches exhaled collectively. Relief mingled with exhaustion. Fear still lingered, yet a profound understanding settled. They had faced monsters and survived. Folklore merged fully with fact. Stories told around small fires, the cannon that could see, the barrel that hunted the bravest. the recoil that shook the earth, and yet every tale was anchored in reality. Every legend a reflection of the mechanical power that had been, and the human will that had endured. Night descended, silent except for distant animal calls and the whisper of wind through scarred trees. Soldiers huddled in wet trenches, dreams of iron giants and earth-shattering shells haunting slumber. Yet in that quiet, a sense of continuity, that they had withstood the impossible, that the front, though battered, remained, that courage, however tested, had held. And so the aftermath settled. Maps would be drawn, logs filed, reports archived. Historians would study the guns, the ranges, the trajectories. Engineers would marvel at precision. Soldiers would carry memories, scars, nightmares, and tales, fact intertwined with folklore, the legacy of those days written in steel mud and human endurance. The Eastern Front. October 1916. Russian soldiers stared across the mud-churned landscape, counting their losses, measuring their courage, feeling the tremor of history beneath their feet. The siege cannons had struck with terrible force, yet the human spirit, though battered, remained, standing, breathing, remembering. The night descended slowly over the scarred fields, trenches now silent, the fog curling like smoke over craters. The air still carried the faint tang of gunpowder and iron. Each footprint, each splintered timber a memory, a reminder of what had transpired. Russian soldiers huddled under tattered canvas, some staring into the dark, eyes wide, recalling the colossal cannons, the ground trembling beneath their feet, the roar still echoing in ears. In the distance, the horizon faded into shades of gray and black. Remnants of smoke from spent shells lingered. A gentle wind swept across mud and frozen water, carrying whispers from the past, the whispers of comrades lost, of the fallen who had vanished beneath iron and earth, yet also of those who endured, walking slowly, carefully through the chaos, their breath visible in the cold night air, mingling with mist, with memory, with fear. Sergeant Petrov sat quietly, helmet resting on his knee, staring at the silhouette of a distant cannon, still smoking, still menacing, the ground around it scarred, a monument not to victory, but to endurance. He exhaled slowly, thinking of the men he had lost, thinking of those still alive, counting each breath as though it were a victory, every heartbeat a testament. That courage, though battered, had survived. The men spoke in whispers, recounting moments. The shell that flew just meters above Ivanov's head, the recoil that shook the trench walls, the way mud and timber had become indistinguishable. Stories grew, exaggerated slightly in tone, embellished with superstition. The cannon became a living entity in their narratives, a ghostly predator, yet rooted firmly in reality. Fact and folklore intertwined seamlessly, teaching lessons in fear, endurance, and awe. Letters would later be written, diaries filled, recollections recorded in trembling handwriting, the scale of what they had faced documented meticulously. Historians would later pore over these accounts, comparing artillery logs, trajectories, shell weights, distances. Yet the human experience, the tremor of fear, the rhythm of breath, the pulse of survival, could never be fully captured in numbers. In quiet moments, soldiers stared across the moonlit fields, shadows stretching over mud and timber, distant trees silhouetted against the dim sky. The battlefield itself seemed alive, breathing, whispering, teaching a lesson older than war. That power once unleashed reshapes everything, Not just the land, not just lives, but the mind, the soul, memory, the way men measure themselves against forces far beyond comprehension. Ivanov remembered the first day, the awe, the terror, the tremor beneath his feet, the hum of anticipation, the roar of shells. And now, months later, he realized survival had changed him, made him smaller in some ways, yet larger in others. Human endurance stretching thin, yet somehow unbroken. The cannon may have dominated the field, but it could not conquer resolve. The mind, the spirit. Stories spread beyond the front. Villages and towns retold them. Exaggerations mixed with truth. Children hearing of iron monsters, of barrels taller than houses, of men standing unflinching. The legend grew, yet each story rooted in fact, a bridge between human perception and industrial might, a reminder that history is written not only in documents, but in memory, in awe, in fear, in survival. The battlefield fell silent. Night deepening. Stars hidden behind a heavy sky. A faint breeze carrying the echo of explosions past. The ghosts of men lingering in shadows. Footprints frozen in mud. The subtle vibrations of a world reshaped. Engineers would later return, measure, catalog, theorize. Yet nothing could capture fully the texture of fear, the pulse of anticipation, the hum of life against steel. Even the cannons now dormant seemed to hold a presence, a lingering reminder of human limits, of industrial ambition, of the thin line between survival and annihilation. Each barrel a teacher, each recoil a lesson in humility, and the soldiers sitting quietly in their trenches, reflected, thought, remembered, and breathed, slowly, deliberately, feeling the weight of what had passed, and the faint possibility of what might come. Some lessons are written in smoke and steel, others in silence, in the hush that follows destruction, in the tremor that lingers long after the echo has faded. The Eastern Front, October 1916. A theater of human endurance, of industrial monstrosity, of courage, of fear. A place where every man discovered the limits of his body, the depth of his spirit, and the fragile thread that separates life from obliteration. As dawn threatened the horizon, a soft light brushing the shell-torn fields, the soldiers rose, slowly, cautiously, aware that the world had changed, that they had changed, yet still moving forward, because the front waits for no one, because history marches on, and the echoes of steel and fire will remain, lingering, teaching, haunting. And so it ends. Not with a declaration of victory, not with fanfare, but with the quiet acknowledgement that men survived, endured, bore witness, and carried forward the memory of monsters wrought in steel. The pulse of artillery still thumping in imagination, the reverberation of courage resonating, soft, persistent, fading, yet never fully gone. The next story begins where the last echo faded, the lessons of iron and mud awaiting their next listener.